The storm raged outside, but inside Margaret's quiet home, the real danger had just begun. The crash of shattered glass echoed through the darkened hallway, and Margaret clutched the heavy skillet in her trembling hands, her heart pounding like a drum. Max, her loyal shepherd, stood rigid at her side, his teeth bared and a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Footsteps approached from the shadows, slow and deliberate, as a masked figure emerged, his voice dripping with menace. "You can't hide forever," he sneered, the blade in his hand catching the faint glow of lightning through the window. Margaret's breath hitched, but she tightened her grip. She wasn't alone. Max wouldn't let her face this nightmare without a fight. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, a patchwork quilt draped over her knees, the late afternoon sun casting golden light across the living room. The rhythmic creak of her rocking chair blended with the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Outside, a breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine into the open window. At her feet, Max, her loyal Belgian shepherd, lay stretched out, his ears twitching at every faint sound. His glossy black antan coat shone in the sunlight, and his golden eyes occasionally flicked toward the window. Margaret smiled, reaching down to stroke his head. "You hear something again, boy?" she asked softly. "You've been so jumpy lately." Max's ears perked, but he didn't lift his head. He let out a low, almost inaudible growl, his muscles tensing slightly. Margaret glanced toward the window, but all she could see were the swaying branches of the old oak tree. "It's probably just the wind," she murmured, more to herself than to him. The house was quiet, as it always was. Since her husband, George, had passed away 3 years ago, the stillness had been both a comfort and a burden. Margaret had grown used to the silence, finding solace in her routines. Max had been her saving grace, filling the void with his presence. He wasn't just her protector, he was her family. The evening unfolded like any other. Margaret prepared a simple dinner, humming an old tune as she moved about the kitchen. Max followed her closely, his nails clicking against the tiled floor. She placed a plate of leftovers on the floor for him and chuckled as he devoured it eagerly. "You're my shadow," she said fondly. "Always underfoot." After dinner, she settled back into her chair, a cup of tea warming her hands. Max curled up at her feet, his body a reassuring weight against her legs. She reached for her book, a worn paperback with creased pages, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. The sense of unease she'd felt earlier lingered, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Max stirred suddenly, lifting his head and letting out a quiet, throaty growl. His gaze was fixed on the doorway that led to the back porch. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What is it, Max?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stood, his ears rigid, and took a step toward the door. Margaret set her teacup down, her hands trembling slightly. She followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The porch light illuminated the backyard, casting long shadows across the lawn. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "It's probably just a raccoon," she said aloud, as much for her own benefit as for Max's. "You're always on high alert, aren't you?" Max didn't relax. His growl deepened, and his eyes remained fixed on the door. Margaret hesitated, debating whether to check the locks again. She had already done so twice that evening, a habit that had grown more frequent in recent weeks. Something about the quietness of the house, the way Max had been acting, it made her feel like a thread stretched too tight, ready to snap. Before heading to bed, Margaret double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. Max followed her from room to room, his presence both reassuring and unnerving. She tried to dismiss her unease, chalking it up to her imagination. After all, what was there to fear out here? Her house was surrounded by woods, far from the noise and chaos of the city. It was supposed to be safe. But as she lay in bed that night, the wind howling softly through the trees, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Max lay beside her bed, his head resting on his paws. His ears twitched with every creak and groan of the old house. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath, willing herself to sleep. "It's just the wind," she whispered into the darkness. Just the wind. But Max didn't sleep. His golden eyes remained open, watching, waiting. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, bathing the living room in soft, golden light. Margaret sipped her tea slowly, the warmth soothing her as she replayed the events of the previous night. She had barely slept, her mind caught in a cycle of doubt and unease. Max sat by her feet, his body tense, his eyes darting toward the windows as if still on alert. "You didn't sleep either, did you?" Margaret said, reaching down to ruffle his fur. Max didn't respond the way he normally would, his focus elsewhere. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. As she set her cup down, Margaret decided to busy herself with chores. She moved to the kitchen, humming softly to distract her mind. Max followed her, his nails clicking against the floor. While washing dishes, she noticed something strange, a thin layer of dirt on the counter near the back door. Margaret frowned, grabbing a cloth to wipe it away. "That's odd," she muttered. She had cleaned the kitchen just the day before. Her gaze shifted to the door, and her breath caught. The lock was slightly ajar, the bolt not fully engaged. She quickly turned the lock, her hands trembling. "I must have forgotten," she said aloud, trying to convince herself. But the memory of checking all the locks the night before was vivid in her mind. Max stood beside her, his ears twitching. He sniffed the air, then the base of the door, letting out a low whine. Margaret's unease only grew as the day went on. She found herself checking the windows repeatedly, scanning the yard for anything out of place. The tension in her chest made it hard to concentrate. Even Max, usually her source of comfort, seemed on edge. That afternoon, Margaret was startled by a knock at the front door. She hesitated before answering, peeking through the peephole to see a familiar face. It was Officer Daniels, a young policeman from the local precinct who often checked in on the neighborhood's elderly residents. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Collins," he said with a warm smile when she opened the door. "I was just in the area and thought I'd stop by. How are you and Max doing?" Margaret forced a smile. "We're fine, thank you. Just the usual quiet around here." Daniels nodded but glanced over her shoulder into the house. "Have you heard about the break-ins lately?" "It's been mostly in the next town over, but I'd recommend being extra careful. Keep your doors locked, and if you see anything unusual, don't hesitate to call." The words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. She tightened her grip on the doorframe. "Break-ins? Here in the area?" Daniel's expression softened. "It's probably nothing to worry about, but it's always better to be cautious." She nodded, her thoughts racing. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, she closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. Max nudged her hand with his nose, as if sensing her distress. That evening, the unease from earlier intensified. Margaret was in the living room, knitting to calm her nerves, when Max suddenly bolted to the back door, barking loudly. The sound startled her so much that she dropped her needles. Her heart pounded as she followed him, her hands shaking. "Max, what is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The dog was growling now, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on the door. Margaret hesitated before turning on the porch light. It flickered for a moment before illuminating the small yard. Her eyes scanned the area, but she saw nothing out of place. "Probably a raccoon," she muttered, trying to reassure herself. But Max didn't move. He stood guard at the door, his growl deepening with each passing second. She decided to call the police, her earlier conversation with Daniels fresh in her mind. Her hands fumbled as she dialed the number. "It's probably nothing," she told herself again, but the words felt hollow. When the dispatcher answered, Margaret explained the situation, keeping her voice low. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights lit up her driveway. Officer Daniels was among the responders, his face serious as he approached her. we'll take a look around," he said firmly. "Stay inside with Max." Margaret nodded, watching nervously from the window as the officers searched the property. They checked the yard, the porch, and even the woods that bordered her home. After what felt like an eternity, Daniels returned to the house. "Nothing out there, Mrs. Collins," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "If someone was here, they're gone now. But you did the right thing calling us." Margaret nodded, clutching the edge of her cardigan. "Thank you," she said, though the relief she expected didn't come. Max remained at the door, his body tense, his eyes locked on the darkness beyond the porch. That night, Margaret double-checked every lock and window in the house. She left the porch light on, its glow a small comfort against the encroaching night. Max refused to leave her side, his ears constantly twitching at the faintest sound. As she climbed into bed, Margaret pulled the quilt up to her chin, her hands trembling. "It's just nerves," she whispered to herself. Nothing happened. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. And as Max lay at her feet, his body rigid and his golden eyes alert, she realized she wasn't the only one who felt it. The following morning brought little relief. The sun rose as usual, spilling light through the curtains, but Margaret woke with a lingering sense of unease. Her dreams had been fractured and restless, filled with shadows and the faint echoes of Max's growls. He lay beside her bed, his ears perked up, his eyes scanning the room as if he hadn't slept at all. Margaret swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet meeting the cold floor. "Come on, boy," she said softly, her voice more for her own reassurance than his. "Let's start the day." As she moved through her morning routine, Max stayed close, his watchful presence a reminder that the tension in the house hadn't dissipated. Margaret's eyes frequently drifted to the windows and doors, her mind replaying the police visit from the night before. Daniels had said there was nothing to worry about, but Max's behavior told her otherwise. By mid-afternoon, Margaret decided to tackle some cleaning to distract herself. She pulled out her cleaning supplies and set to work in the kitchen, scrubbing the counters and wiping down the cabinets. It wasn't long before she noticed something unsettling. One of her kitchen knives was missing. Margaret stared at the empty slot in the wooden block, her mind racing. She searched the drawers and counters, convincing herself she had misplaced it. But the harder she looked, the more certain she became, it was gone. "Did I leave it somewhere?" she muttered, her voice trembling. Max tilted his head at her, sensing her distress. She shook her head and forced a smile. "I'm just getting forgetful, that's all." But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. The day dragged on, the atmosphere in the house growing heavier with each passing hour. Margaret sat in her armchair, knitting to calm her nerves, but her hands trembled too much to make any progress. The television played softly in the background, though she wasn't paying attention. Max lay at her feet, his body tense, his ears flicking at every creak of the old house. As the evening approached, the weather began to change. Thick gray clouds gathered overhead, and a brisk wind rattled the windows. Margaret sighed, turning off the television and pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "I suppose a storm's coming," she said to Max. He looked up at her with those intelligent, golden eyes, his tail giving a single wag as if to acknowledge her words. She stood and walked to the window, peering out at the darkening sky. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. Margaret shivered and drew the curtains, shutting out the eerie sight. That night, the storm hit with full force. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. Margaret sat in her armchair, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in her chest. Max sat by the back door, his ears perked and his body rigid. The power flickered once, then again, before going out entirely. The house plunged into darkness, and Margaret's breath caught. She set her cup down carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's just the storm," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. She reached for the flashlight she kept on the table beside her chair, clicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the room in sharp, shifting shadows. Max let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on the back door. Margaret's grip on the flashlight tightened as she followed his gaze. The sound of breaking glass shattered the air, and she froze. Someone was inside. Margaret's instincts kicked in. She turned off the flashlight and slipped into the shadows, her breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. Max stood in front of her, his growl deepening into a menacing snarl. His body was a wall of muscle and determination, ready to defend her at all costs. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate. Margaret's heart raced as she pressed herself against the wall, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. She strained to hear, her ears picking up the faint creak of the floorboards and the sound of labored breathing. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "Think." Max moved silently, his body low to the ground as he crept toward the sound. Margaret watched him, her hands shaking. She didn't want him to get hurt, but she knew he wouldn't back down. The intruder's silhouette appeared at the end of the hallway, a tall figure cloaked in shadows. Max lunged with a ferocious bark, his teeth flashing in the darkness. The man cursed and stumbled back, the sound of a scuffle filling the air. Margaret took the opportunity to move toward the kitchen, her mind racing. She needed a weapon, something to protect herself and Max. Her fingers fumbled through the drawers until they closed around a heavy cast iron skillet. Another crash echoed from the hallway, followed by a yelp from Max. Margaret's heart sank, but she gritted her teeth and tightened her grip on the skillet. She wasn't going to let anyone hurt her or her dog. The footsteps grew louder, the intruder moving closer to the kitchen. Margaret positioned herself in the corner, her breathing steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Max reappeared, his limp barely noticeable as he stood protectively in front of her. The figure entered the kitchen, his outline illuminated by the faint glow of lightning outside. Margaret held her breath, waiting for the right moment. Max growled, low and threatening, his teeth bared. "Get out of my house," Margaret said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. The man laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "I don't think so, lady." Margaret didn't hesitate. She swung the skillet with all her strength, the sound of metal meeting flesh echoing through the room. The man staggered back, cursing loudly. Max lunged again, this time sinking his teeth into the man's arm. The intruder screamed, flailing as he tried to shake the dog off. Margaret stepped forward, her fear replaced by a surge of determination. "Get out," she shouted, raising the skillet again. The man stumbled toward the door, dragging himself out into the storm. Margaret slammed the door shut behind him, locking it with trembling hands. She leaned against it, her breath coming in gasps as Max stood beside her, his growls slowly fading. The storm raged outside, rain hammering against the windows and wind howling like an anguished spirit. Margaret leaned against the door, her trembling hands still clutching the cast iron skillet. Max stood beside her, his fur bristling and his golden eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass panes. But Margaret's sense of relief was short-lived. From the far side of the house came the sharp sound of breaking wood. Her heart stopped. Another entry point. They weren't finished. Max barked furiously, his deep, guttural sounds cutting through the storm. Margaret's mind raced. She grabbed her flashlight and moved cautiously toward the noise, Max staying glued to her side. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounded like a gunshot in the suffocating silence of the house. The intruders were inside. Margaret caught sight of them as she peered around the corner of the hallway. Two men, both wearing dark clothing and masks, moved through her living room with calculated precision. One of them carried a crowbar, while the other had a small flashlight that swept across the room, illuminating every corner. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Max growled low, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. She gently placed a hand on his head, as much to calm him as to steady herself. The men were speaking in low tones, their voices barely audible over the storm. "She's got to have something valuable in here," one of them said. "Old houses like this always do." The second man nodded, his voice colder. "Check the back rooms. I'll handle the dog if it gets in the way." Margaret's blood ran cold. Her hands tightened around the skillet, and she backed away as quietly as she could. The hallway felt impossibly long as she crept toward the kitchen, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it. The intruders moved methodically, opening drawers, overturning furniture, and smashing picture frames in their search. Margaret crouched behind the kitchen island, Max positioned in front of her like a living shield. She tried to think, her mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. Calling the police was out, the phone line was dead, and her cell phone was upstairs, far out of reach. A loud crash startled her. The man with the crowbar had knocked over a bookshelf, scattering its contents across the floor. He barked orders to his partner. "You check the bedrooms. I'll finish searching here." The second man moved down the hallway, heading directly for Margaret's hiding spot. As his footsteps grew louder, Margaret tightened her grip on the skillet. Max's growls deepened, a warning that reverberated through the air. The intruder hesitated, shining his flashlight into the kitchen. The beam of light landed on Max's gleaming eyes, and for a moment, there was silence. Then Max launched himself forward. The man barely had time to react. Max collided with him, teeth sinking into his arm as the flashlight clattered to the floor. The intruder screamed, flailing as he tried to shake Max off, but the dog held firm, his growls turning into feral snarls. Margaret stepped out from behind the island, adrenaline surging through her veins. She swung the skillet with all her strength, striking the man's leg. He collapsed to the floor, cursing loudly as Max released his grip and repositioned himself for another attack. "Stay down," Margaret shouted, her voice trembling but fierce. But the victory was short-lived. The second man appeared in the doorway, his crowbar raised. Margaret froze as he advanced, his expression hidden behind the mask, but his intent clear. Max turned his attention to the second intruder, his body a blur of motion as he lunged again. The man swung the crowbar, narrowly missing the dog as Max darted to the side. Margaret backed away, her hands fumbling for something, anything, she could use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around a heavy glass vase on the counter. The intruder's attention shifted to Margaret, and she didn't hesitate. She hurled the vase at him, the glass shattering against his shoulder. He stumbled, giving Max the opening he needed. The dog leaped, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's wrist. The crowbar fell to the floor with a metallic clang. Margaret moved quickly, grabbing the crowbar and holding it in front of her like a shield. The first intruder had managed to get back on his feet, his movements slower but no less dangerous. He reached for a knife tucked into his belt, his eyes locked on Margaret. "You don't want to do this," Margaret said, her voice low and steady despite the terror coursing through her. The man laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "And what are you going to do about it, old lady?" Before she could answer, Max lunged at him again, his teeth flashing. The man fell backward, crashing into the overturned bookshelf. Margaret seized the moment, gripping the crowbar tightly as she stepped forward. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice firm. The intruders exchanged a glance, clearly reevaluating their plan. Between Max's relentless attacks and Margaret's unexpected resolve, they were losing their advantage. The man with the knife cursed under his breath. "This isn't worth it," he muttered to his partner. "Let's go." The two men stumbled toward the front door, their movements frantic. Margaret followed at a safe distance, the crowbar still in her hands. Max remained by her side, his growls rumbling like distant thunder. As the intruders fled into the storm, Margaret slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands shaking. She turned to Max, who was panting heavily but otherwise unharmed. Dropping the crowbar, she knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around his neck. "You're incredible," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me." Max licked her cheek, his tail wagging faintly despite his exhaustion. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the house was quiet once more. Margaret leaned against the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. They had survived. But she knew this wasn't over. Margaret sat on the cold kitchen floor, Max lying at her side, both catching their breath after the chaos of the intrusion. Her trembling hand rested on his fur, seeking comfort in his steady presence. Though the two men had fled, the damage they had caused remained, both to her home and to her sense of safety. The thought of them returning sent a shiver down her spine. She knew she couldn't wait for help to arrive. They might come back, and next time, they wouldn't hesitate. Margaret pulled herself to her feet, her fingers tightening around the crowbar she had taken from one of the intruders. She turned to Max, his golden eyes fixed on her, and whispered, "We're not done yet, boy." The first sign of trouble came quickly. A loud crash echoed from the basement, the sound of something heavy toppling over. Margaret froze, her pulse quickening. The realization hit her like a cold wave: the men hadn't left. At least one of them was still inside. Max's ears perked up, his growl low and steady. He moved toward the basement door, his body tense and ready. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before following him. She reached for the flashlight on the counter, its beam piercing the shadows as she descended the creaking steps. The basement was dimly lit by the storm's sporadic lightning, casting eerie shadows across the cluttered space. Margaret swept the flashlight across the room, the beam landing on an overturned shelf and scattered tools. Max moved ahead of her, his growls growing louder. "Come out," Margaret called, her voice steady despite the fear knotting her stomach. "I know you're down here." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness. The intruder was the one Max had bitten earlier. His mask was gone, revealing a middle-aged man with a sneer that sent a chill down Margaret's spine. His arm hung limply at his side, blood staining the sleeve of his shirt. "You've got guts," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "But you should have stayed quiet." Margaret tightened her grip on the crowbar. "Get out of my house." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the basement. "Not until I get what I came for." Margaret's mind raced. What could he possibly want? Her home was modest, her possessions ordinary. Nothing seemed worth the risk he had taken by staying behind. The man moved closer, his steps deliberate, his eyes darting toward the shelves as if searching for something. Max barked sharply, lunging forward. The man jumped back, raising his good arm defensively. Margaret seized the opportunity, stepping between him and the stairs. "You're not going anywhere," she said firmly. The man's patience snapped. He lunged toward Margaret, his injured arm swinging weakly. Max intercepted him, sinking his teeth into the man's leg. He screamed, stumbling back and crashing into the workbench. Margaret advanced, her heart pounding as she swung the crowbar with all her strength. The sound of metal meeting flesh was sickening. The man crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. Max stood over him, growling menacingly, his teeth bared. Margaret didn't wait for him to recover. She reached for the emergency alarm installed years ago, a relic from her husband's cautious nature. Pressing the button, she heard the faint chime that signaled a distress call had been sent to the local authorities. "You've got a few minutes before the police get here," she said, her voice cold. "I suggest you use them." The man glared at her, but the fight had drained from his eyes. He staggered to his feet, his movements slow and labored. Max stayed close, ready to strike again if he made a wrong move. Margaret followed him up the stairs, her crowbar still in hand. The house was eerily quiet, the storm outside beginning to die down. The man limped toward the front door, pausing only to cast one last, hateful glance at Margaret. "This isn't over," he spat. Margaret met his gaze, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. Yes, it is. She slammed the door behind him, locking it with trembling hands. Max barked once, a sharp, decisive sound, as if to punctuate her words. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Margaret paced the living room, her body still humming with adrenaline. Max stayed by her side, his gaze fixed on the door. When the sound of sirens finally broke the silence, Margaret felt a wave of relief so intense it brought her to tears. Officer Daniels was the first to arrive. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Margaret. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. Margaret nodded, though her voice shook as she replied. "They were here. 2 men. One of them. I think he's still nearby." Daniels gestured for his colleagues to begin a search, then turned back to Margaret. "Tell me everything." As Margaret recounted the events of the night, she realized just how much she had endured. From the initial break-in to the final confrontation in the basement, it felt like a nightmare she had barely survived. But through it all, Max had been her anchor, his bravery giving her the strength to fight back. When she finished, Daniels nodded solemnly. "You did everything right. And your dog," he glanced at Max, who sat proudly at Margaret's feet. "He's a hero." Margaret smiled faintly, reaching down to stroke Max's head. "He saved me," she said simply. The police found the second intruder a few blocks away, injured and unable to flee. Both men were taken into custody, their motives still unclear. Margaret sat by the window, watching as the flashing lights disappeared into the distance. The house was quiet once more, but the silence felt different now, less oppressive, more like a sanctuary reclaimed. She turned to Max, who had finally allowed himself to relax. His eyes drooped with exhaustion, but his tail thumped softly against the floor. Margaret knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his fur. "We did it, Max," she whispered. "We're safe." Max let out a contented sigh, his head resting on her lap. Margaret leaned back against the wall, her body and mind finally beginning to unwind. The storm had passed, and with it, the darkness that had threatened her home. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. Even with the police having assured her that the intruders were in custody, a lingering unease kept her awake. The house, her sanctuary for so many years, now felt fragile, like a fortress breached. Max lay curled up beside her bed, his golden eyes half open, as though he, too, refused to let his guard down entirely. Morning brought a quiet stillness, the storm having washed the world clean. Margaret brewed a pot of tea, the familiar routine grounding her. She glanced out the window, taking in the damp lawn and the shards of a broken flower pot scattered near the porch. It was a stark reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. "Come on, Max," she said, setting a bowl of fresh water on the floor. He padded over, his tail wagging slightly, but his eyes remained vigilant. Margaret knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You've done enough, boy. You can rest now." But rest wasn't in the cards. Later that afternoon, a knock at the door startled her. Margaret peeked through the peephole and sighed in relief when she saw Officer Daniels. She opened the door, greeting him with a faint smile. "Good afternoon, officer. Everything all right?" Daniels nodded, but his expression was grim. "We have some news, Mrs. Collins. One of the intruders, the man you confronted in the basement, he's claiming there's something hidden in your house. Something valuable." Margaret frowned, her heart skipping a beat. "Hidden? What could they possibly mean? I've lived here for over 30 years, there's nothing like that here." Daniels hesitated before responding. "It's possible they were misinformed. But we've seen cases like this before, criminals convinced there's a safe or stash of money in an older home. It might explain why they targeted you." Margaret shook her head, her thoughts racing. She remembered how the men had torn through her belongings, their search methodical. What if they had left something behind? A clue? Her chest tightened as she recalled the one man's chilling words, "This isn't over." "I'll be careful," she said firmly. "And Max will keep watch." Daniels nodded. "If you find anything, call us immediately." That evening, Margaret decided to search the basement herself. It was a mess from the struggle the night before, tools and boxes scattered across the floor. She moved cautiously, Max at her side, his nose sniffing the air. As she sifted through the debris, her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard near the workbench. Frowning, she knelt and pried it up. Beneath it, she found a small, metal box covered in dust. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing a stack of papers and an old pocket watch. At first glance, the contents seemed unremarkable, but Margaret knew better. These weren't hers. Before she could examine the papers further, Max's sharp bark broke the silence. Margaret froze, her heart pounding as she listened. The sound of footsteps above sent a cold wave of fear through her. Someone was in the house. Margaret grabbed the crowbar she had left near the stairs, her mind racing. Max positioned himself in front of her, his body tense and ready. She crept up the steps, her grip on the crowbar tightening with each step. At the top of the stairs, she peeked around the corner. A man stood in her living room, his back to her. He wasn't one of the men from the previous night. This one was taller, broader, and carried an air of menace that made her stomach churn. Max acted first. With a ferocious bark, he lunged at the intruder, his teeth snapping inches from the man's leg. The man spun around, pulling a knife from his jacket. Margaret's instincts took over. She stepped into the room, brandishing the crowbar. "Get out of my house," she shouted, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her. The man sneered, advancing toward her. "I'm not leaving empty-handed, lady." Max lunged again, forcing the man to retreat a step. Margaret took the opportunity to swing the crowbar, the metal glancing off his arm. He cursed, dropping the knife as Max leapt onto him, knocking him to the ground. The struggle was chaotic. The man threw Max off and scrambled for the knife, but Margaret was quicker. She swung the crowbar again, this time connecting with his shoulder. The man cried out, collapsing to the floor. The sound of sirens broke through the tension, their wail growing louder as they approached. Margaret kept the crowbar raised, her eyes locked on the intruder as Max stood over him, growling fiercely. Moments later, the front door burst open, and Officer Daniels entered, his gun drawn. "Drop it," he commanded. The man raised his hands, his face twisted in pain and anger. Daniels moved quickly, cuffing him while his partner secured the area. Margaret lowered the crowbar, her arms shaking from the effort. Daniels turned to her, his expression both relieved and impressed. "You did it again, Mrs. Collins. Are you all right?" Margaret nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. "I'm fine. Max kept me safe." Daniels smiled, glancing at the dog. "He's something special, that's for sure." Later, as the police escorted the man away, Margaret sat on the porch steps, Max leaning against her side. The metal box rested on her lap, its contents still a mystery. Daniels joined her, his expression curious. "Do you want me to take a look at that?" he asked gently. Margaret hesitated before handing him the box. "It's not mine," she said quietly. "I think it belonged to my husband. He never told me about it." Daniels examined the papers, his brow furrowing. "These look like old land deeds, and this pocket watch, it might be valuable. It's possible the intruders knew about this and thought there was more." Margaret sighed, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I never knew George kept anything like this. But I suppose it doesn't matter now." "It's over." Daniels nodded. "We'll make sure it stays that way." That night, as Margaret locked the doors and windows, a sense of peace settled over her for the first time in days. Max followed her to bed, curling up at her feet as he always did. She reached down to scratch his head, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You're my hero," she whispered. "I couldn't have done it without you." Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging slightly. Margaret smiled, her fears finally giving way to exhaustion. As she drifted off to sleep, the house felt secure once more, the bond between her and Max stronger than ever. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains as Margaret stirred awake. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence she hadn't felt in days. At the foot of her bed, Max stretched lazily, letting out a satisfied sigh before looking up at her with his golden eyes. "Good morning, hero," she said softly, reaching down to stroke his fur. His tail thumped against the bed frame, a gentle reminder of his unwavering loyalty. Over the next few days, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The police assured Margaret that the intruders were in custody and that she was no longer in immediate danger. Officer Daniels stopped by frequently to check on her, often with updates or simply to offer support. The metal box and its contents had been sent for further evaluation, though Margaret found herself less concerned about its value and more focused on the safety and comfort of her home. The scars of the ordeal were evident: broken furniture, shattered glass, and a lingering sense of vulnerability, but she refused to let them define her. "I've been through worse," she told Max one afternoon as she swept the living room. "And I've always made it through, haven't I?" Max, lying by the hearth, wagged his tail as if to agree. The local news picked up the story, framing Margaret and Max as unlikely heroes. Headlines like "Brave Dog Saves Elderly Woman During Home Invasion" and "Max the Hero Shepherd, a Story of Loyalty and Courage" began circulating. Neighbors and strangers alike sent letters of admiration, and one morning, Margaret opened her door to find a bouquet of flowers left on her porch. "I don't know what to make of all this attention," Margaret said, reading one of the notes aloud. "You and Max are an inspiration. Thank you for reminding us of the power of courage." She shook her head, smiling at Max. "I'm not sure we did anything that special." But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. As the days turned to weeks, Margaret and Max fell back into their familiar routines. Yet, there was something different in how Margaret carried herself. She felt a newfound strength, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The ordeal had forced her to confront fears she didn't realize she still carried, and with Max by her side, she had come out stronger. One afternoon, Daniels visited with a small, wrapped package in hand. "Thought you might want this," he said, handing it to Margaret. "It's the pocket watch we found in the box. Turns out, it's not worth much financially, but I thought you'd like to keep it." Margaret unwrapped the package carefully, her fingers brushing over the tarnished surface of the watch. It was old and worn, yet beautiful in its simplicity. She opened it, revealing an inscription on the inside: "To George, time is our most precious gift. Love, Margaret." Her breath caught. She had given this to her husband decades ago, on their anniversary. She hadn't seen it in years. "I can't believe he kept this," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, officer." Daniels nodded. It seems George knew what mattered most. That evening, Margaret placed the pocket watch on the mantel, right beside a framed photo of her and George on their wedding day. Max watched her quietly from his spot by the hearth, his presence a comforting weight in the room. Margaret turned to him, a soft smile on her lips. "We've been through a lot, haven't we? But I think we're going to be okay." Max wagged his tail, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the firelight. Margaret knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You've been my guardian angel, Max. I don't know what I'd do without you." The dog leaned into her embrace, his soft huff of contentment saying more than words ever could. As the sun set that night, Margaret sat on the porch with Max at her feet. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. She gazed out at the horizon, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The events of the past week had shaken her, but they had also reminded her of the strength she carried within, the strength to protect herself, to persevere, and to trust in the bond she shared with Max. It was a bond forged in loyalty, tested by adversity, and unbreakable in its depth. "We're a good team," she said aloud, scratching Max behind the ears. "No matter what comes next, we'll face it together." Max looked up at her, his tail wagging slowly, as if to say he agreed. The stars began to appear one by one, their light steady and enduring. Margaret leaned back, closing her eyes as the gentle sounds of the night surrounded her. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. And beside her, Max kept watch, as he always would.